Have you ever heard of unobtainium? It's the magical energy mineral found on the planet Pandora in the movie Avatar. It's a fantasy in a science fiction script. But environmentalists think they found it here on Earth in the form of wind and solar power. They think all the energy we need can be supplied by building enough wind and solar farms and enough batteries. The simple truth is that we can't, nor should we want to, not if our goal is to be good stewards of the planet. To understand why, consider some simple physics realities that aren't being talked about. All sources of energy have limits that can't be exceeded. The maximum rate at which the sun's photons can be converted to electrons is about 33%. Our best solar technology is at 26% efficiency. For wind, the maximum capture is 60%. Our best machines are at 45%. So we're pretty close to wind and solar limits. Despite PR claims about big gains coming, there just aren't any possible. And wind and solar only work when the wind blows and the sun shines, but we need energy all the time. The solution, we're told, is to use batteries. Again, physics and chemistry make this very hard to do. Consider the world's biggest battery factory, the one Tesla built in Nevada. It would take 500 years for that factory to make enough batteries to store just 1 day's worth of America's electricity needs. This helps explain why wind and solar currently still supply less than 3% of the world's energy, after 20 years and billions of dollars in subsidies. Putting aside the economics, if your motive is to protect the environment, you might want to rethink wind, solar, and batteries because, like all machines, they're built from non-renewable materials. Consider some sobering numbers. A single electric car battery weighs about half a ton. Fabricating one requires digging up, moving, and processing more than 250 tons of earth somewhere on the planet. Building a single 100-megawatt wind farm can power 75,000 homes requires some 30,000 tons of iron ore and 50,000 tons of concrete, as well as 900 tons of non-recyclable plastics for the huge blades. To get the same power from solar, the amount of cement, steel, and glass needed is 150% greater. Then there's the other minerals needed, including elements known as rare earth metals. With current plans, the world will need an incredible 200 to 2,000% increase in mining for elements such as cobalt, lithium, and dysprosium, to name just a few. Where is all this stuff going to come from? Massive new mining operations, almost none of it in America, some imported from places hostile to America, and some places we all want to protect. Australia's Institute for Sustainable Futures cautions that a global gold rush for energy materials will take miners into remote wilderness areas that have maintained high biodiversity because they haven't yet been disturbed. And who's doing the mining? Well, let's just say that they're not all going to be union workers with union protections. Amnesty International paints a disturbing picture. The marketing of state-of-the-art technologies are a stark contrast to the children carrying bags of rocks. And then the mining itself requires massive amounts of conventional energy, as do the energy-intensive industrial processes needed to refine the materials and then build the wind, solar, battery hardware. Then there's the waste. Wind turbines, solar panels, and batteries have a relatively short life, about 20 years. Conventional energy machines like gas turbines last twice as long. With current plans, the International Renewable Energy Agency calculates that by 2050, the disposal of worn-out solar panels will constitute over double the tonnage of all of today's global plastic waste. Worn-out wind turbines and batteries will add millions of tons more waste. It'll be a whole new environmental challenge. Before we launch history's biggest increase in mining, dig up millions of acres in pristine areas, encourage childhood labor, and create epic waste problems, we might want to reconsider our almost inexhaustible supply of hydrocarbons, the fuels that make our marvelous modern world possible. And technology is making it easier to acquire and cleaner to use them every day. The following comparisons are typical and instructive. It costs about the same to drill one oil well as it does to build one giant wind turbine. And while that turbine generates the energy equivalent of about 1 barrel of oil per hour, the oil rig produces 10 barrels per hour. It costs less than 50 cents to store a barrel of oil or its equivalent in natural gas, but you need $200 worth of batteries to hold the energy contained in one oil barrel. Next time someone tells you that wind, solar, and batteries are the magical solution for all our energy needs, ask them if they have an idea of the cost to the environment. Unobtainium works fine in the movies, but we don't live in the movies. We live in the real world. I'm Mark Mills, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Prager University.
Do we need to destroy the environment to save it? That's the question I faced a few years ago. I co-founded a movement that was the precursor to the Green New Deal. It was called the New Apollo Project. If we could send a man to the moon, we reasoned, surely we could save our own planet. All we had to do was harness the power of the wind and the sun and get rid of fossil fuels. Compared to the original Apollo mission, how hard could that be? Well, it turned out to be very hard, practically impossible, in fact. The basic laws of physics and chemistry proved to be very stubborn. But as I did more and more research, something else began to trouble me. The prospect that pushing the planet toward wind and solar energy would actually cause more harm to the environment than good. There's no better example of this than what wind and solar energy do to birds. Industrial wind turbines, those giant generators of wind power, are the greatest new threat to golden and bald eagles. But the eagles are hardly the only ones threatened. Condors, owls, hawks, and falcons all fall prey to the turbine's mighty blades. Big wind, and believe me, there's a big wind industry now, just like there's big oil and big pharma, claims that house cats kill more birds than wind turbines. That's true, but whereas cats kill small, common birds like sparrows, wind turbines kill big, threatened with extinction and slow to reproduce species like bald eagles and condors. Indeed, industrial wind farms are killing fields for birds. The more turbines you put up, the more birds you're going to slaughter. According to the American Bird Conservancy in 2017, research shows that hundreds of thousands of birds and bats die every year when they accidentally collide with the turbine blades. That number grows with each turbine built. The Royal Society for the Preservation of Birds reports that wind farms built off the coast of Britain could be the final nail in the coffin for endangered seabirds. The Center for Biological Diversity calls the Altamont Pass wind farm in California a population sink for golden eagles as well as burrowing owls. As for solar farms, they produce an entirely different set of problems, although they also are very harmful for birds. In California, according to a federal report, massive solar arrays produce heat up to 900 degrees. When birds fly into those arrays, they simply burn up. Building a solar farm is a lot like building any other kind of massive industrial facility. You have to clear the whole area of wildlife. For example, in order to construct the Ivanpah Solar Farm in California near the Nevada border, developers hired biologists to pull threatened desert tortoises from their burrows. The tortoises were then loaded on the back of pickup trucks and caged in pens, where many ended up dying. Solar farms also need millions and millions of gallons of water to clean the mirrors and to generate power. Since most solar farms are built in the desert, we're talking about a precious resource already in short supply. When push comes to shove, water could become the real throttle on renewable solar energy, according to Michael Weber, professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Texas at Austin. Then there's the issue of what to do with solar panels that wear out. The panels contain lead and other toxic chemicals that can't be removed without breaking up the entire panel. Since it's far cheaper for solar manufacturers to just buy the raw materials than recycle old panels, those old panels end up in landfills, or as the New York Times discovered in a 2019 investigation, dumped in poor African nations. Wind turbines may have an even worse disposal problem than solar panels. First, they are gigantic. A single blade can be longer than a wing on a jumbo jet. Second, they're made of fiberglass, which has to be cut by a diamond-studded saw to be carted away on giant trucks. And as with solar panels, the only thing to do is bury them, toxic materials and all. This is done, as you can imagine, in enormous pits, creating yet another landfill problem. All this environmental degradation is happening on a relatively small scale right now because we get less than 10% of our electricity from wind and solar sources. If we were really to embark on a wind and solar build-out of the kind environmentalists advocate, the damage would be much, much greater. Consider this. Today's energy system requires just 0.5% of the land in the US. If we were to get all the energy we now use from wind and solar, at least 25% of all land in the US would be required. That's a lot of dead wildlife. Doesn't sound very green, does it? I'm Michael Schellenberger, founder and president of Environmental Progress and author of Apocalypse Never for Prager University. France gets 70% of its power from one carbon-free source. Sweden 40%, Switzerland 36%, the United States 20%. For those who wish to create a world free of carbon emissions, France is clearly the role model. That source of energy, by the way, is not solar or wind. It's not coal, oil, or natural gas either. It's nuclear. Nuclear energy is not only cleaner than all other forms of energy, it's also cheaper to create, abundant, and safe. Yes, safe. So if the world is going to end in a few years because of global warming due to rising CO2 levels, why aren't we going all out to produce this abundant, clean, and safe form of energy? Why aren't there dozens of nuclear power plants in development all over the world? Well, we all know the answer, right? Nuclear energy is just too risky. It's too dangerous. So even though we're told we're facing an existential crisis, which means humans may cease to exist, even though we might all wither away in unbearable heat or starve because of worldwide droughts or drown in rising seas or be killed in Mad Max-style riots, nuclear energy is off the table because it's too darn risky. I want to make sure I have this right. The goal is to save humanity. There's a way to save humanity, and we won't take it because we're afraid there might be a bad accident or something. Does that make sense to you? Because it doesn't to me. But maybe I'm not giving enough weight to the safety argument. So let's take a closer look at that, since no one, not even the most radical environmentalist, disputes that nuclear power produces massive amounts of energy cleanly and efficiently. Safety, like everything else, is a matter of context. So here's some context. 1.4 million people die worldwide every year in traffic accidents, 2.3 million in work-related accidents, 4.2 million from air pollution. Deaths directly related to nuclear power? Under 200. Not annually, but in the entire history of the nuclear power industry. But what about those famous nuclear disasters we've all heard so much about? Didn't they poison untold thousands? 3 Mile Island in 1979, Chernobyl in 1986, Fukushima in 2011. Okay, let's deal with each one. 3 Mile Island. There was an accident at that plant, yes, but the amount of radiation that leaked was no more than one might receive taking a chest X-ray. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission acknowledged as much 4 weeks after the initial media hysteria died down. We goofed, the commission told Congress. There was no danger of any hydrogen explosion. But that didn't grab the headlines. Chernobyl. The accident developed into a catastrophe only because of pitiful safety procedures unique to the Soviet Union. It would never have occurred in the West. Even so, initial reports of radiation leakage turned out to be grossly exaggerated. According to the World Health Organization, as of mid-2005, that's 19 years after the explosion, fewer than 50 deaths have been directly attributed to radiation from the disaster. Fukushima. In 2011, as a result of an earthquake and tsunami, the Fukushima nuclear power plant was destroyed and nuclear radiation was released. Yet despite the media hysteria, not one person at the nuclear plant died because of radiation leaks. The deaths that occurred in the area were the result of the tsunami. Well, what about the nuclear waste? Surely that's terribly harmful. Actually, no. All the nuclear waste ever generated in the US can fit on a single football field stacked less than 70 feet high. It's easily and safely buried in steel canisters encased in concrete. All this information is easily available, but the anti-nuclear movement, with the help of their media allies, have spent a tremendous amount of time and money obscuring the facts. They're more interested in filing lawsuits against this particular form of clean energy than telling the truth about it. Those endless lawsuits have helped make it prohibitively expensive to build new plants or even keep older ones running. Ironically, one of the anti-nuclear groups that now litigates against nuclear energy, the Sierra Club, was once a great proponent. The legendary early leader of the club, Will Seery, saw it as the best chance to preserve wildlife. Cheap nuclear power in unlimited quantities is one of the chief factors in allowing a large, rapidly growing population to preserve wildlands, open space, and lands of high scenic value, he told the club in 1966. He was right then, and he's right now. It would take dozens of wind and solar farms covering thousands of acres of land to match the energy a single nuclear power plant can produce. From both an environmental and clean energy point of view, there's no contest. If you want to save the planet, then you want to go nuclear. If you want to save the planet and you don't want to go nuclear, then you're just full of hot air. I'm Michael Schellenberger, founder and president of Environmental Progress and the author of Apocalypse Never for Prager University.
You've heard a lot about big oil, big pharma, big tech, and all the other big bad players out there. I want to talk to you about the biggest, baddest one of them all. This Goliath doesn't deal in billions, it deals in trillions. I'm talking about Big Green. Yes, the environmental movement. It's the richest, most powerful big in the world right now. Nothing else even comes close. Until we see it for what it is and rein it in, it's going to get even bigger. And as is usually the case, bigger is not always better. You see, Big Green wants to take over your life. It has to. This makes perfect sense. Big Green, after all, intends to save the planet from oblivion. Your freedom would seem to be a small price to pay. To accomplish its mission, Big Green needs two things: money and power. It already has a lot of both, but it's hungry for much more. Who do we mean when we say Big Green? We mean the major organizations that set the agenda for the movement. This would include, among dozens, Greenpeace, 350.org, Nature Conservancy, Sierra Club, World Wildlife Fund, and of course, the politicians, bureaucrats, corporations, and media outlets who support and promote their agenda. Before we get any deeper into this, let's stipulate a few things. The climate is changing. It appears, though we can't be sure, to be slowly warming. If it continues to warm, it could cause serious environmental problems sometime in the distant future. Industrialization probably plays a role in this warming process. Reasonable people should be able to agree on this. Democrat leader Nancy Pelosi and Republican leader Newt Gingrich actually once sat down together and said as much in a public service ad they made in the 1990s. But Big Green has no interest in being reasonable. Reasonable doesn't get you money. Reasonable doesn't get you power. So let's talk about the money. Greenpeace, Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, and Sierra Club all have financial assets in the $100 to $300 million range. Name a Fortune 500 company, and chances are they're writing big checks to Big Green. Banking giant Citigroup, for example, has committed $100 billion to combat climate change. But the real money is at the government level. In 2009, the Obama administration directed more than $110 billion to be spent on renewable energy investments under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act alone. What the taxpayer got for this investment, other than long-forgotten $500 million boondoggles like Solyndra, is hard to say. According to the best economic models, the Paris Climate Accord will cost the world $1 to $2 trillion every year. Total cost for the Green New Deal, $52 trillion, minimum. But money is only a means to an end. The end is power. The power to transform society into what they think it should be. That's what this is really about. Here's how Shoykat Chakrabarti, the architect of the Green New Deal, described it to the Washington Post. It wasn't originally a climate thing at all. We really think of it as a how do you change the entire economy thing. Maybe you like all this, that's fine. But don't pretend it's about protecting the environment. Chakrabarti was being honest. You should be too. It's about transferring more and more power to the government at every level, federal, state, local. And the way to get the power is to gin up scary scenarios. The planet is burning. The seas are rising. We're all going to be dead soon unless we listen to those masters of disaster, Al Gore, Bill McKibben, and Greta Thunberg. And what have all their horror stories led to? A generation of young people who have nightmares about a planet burning up around them. Poor people who pay higher energy bills than they need to because of massive subsidies for wind and solar power. Millions of birds, including endangered ones, dying, sliced to pieces by wind turbines. Yet in the midst of all the planet is burning fear-mongering, the world is cleaner, healthier, and richer than it has ever been. Deaths from natural disasters are at all-time lows. Here's why. Human beings adapt when faced with climate problems. We're really good at it. We've been doing it for thousands of years. Sea levels rising, build taller and better seawalls. That's what the Netherlands did. A good chunk of the country, including its international airport, is below sea level. Need more water? Spread the gospel of drip irrigation and desalinization. Israel has more water than it needs, and it's in the middle of a desert. Need clean energy? Build more nuclear power plants. Sweden gets half of its energy from nuclear. None of these simple, practical solutions makes much of an impact on Big Green. You don't raise money off of common sense, and you don't get political power telling people how good things are, and you certainly don't become famous by being calm. Big Green is not poor, not honest, and certainly not powerless. It's time we all plug into that truth. I'm Rogan O'Hanley, aka DC Drano, for Prager University.
I hate clean air and water. I don't care how much companies pollute rivers and streams. I don't even like trees. I just care about tax cuts. Who am I? Well, that's easy. I'm a conservative. Or at least I'm a progressive caricature of a conservative. But the caricature is absurd on its face. Conservatives breathe the same air and drink the same water environmentalists do. Conservatives love taking their kids to the same national parks environmentalists do. In fact, the whole idea of national parks was created by a Republican, Ulysses Grant. The park system was greatly expanded by another Republican, Teddy Roosevelt. And the Environmental Protection Agency was, yes, established by a Republican, Richard Nixon. He liked clean air too. Conservatives want to conserve things. It's right there in the name. And one of the things we want to conserve is our environment, because you can't have a healthy community without a healthy natural environment. That wasn't even hard for me to say, because I believe it. Conservatives love the environment every bit as much as environmentalists do. The question is, what is the best way to protect it? And here's where we have big differences. The environmentalists say the best way, the only way, is through massive federal and even international regulations. Conservatives say the best way to protect the environment is by protecting property rights and encouraging innovation, safer, more efficient power, nuclear, geothermal, biomass, anything that generates energy at a price consumers want and can afford to pay. To the extent that government gets involved in conservation, say protecting wildlife, it should get involved at the most local level possible, since the farmer, forester, or fisherman in Oregon knows a lot more about his environment than some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. or Brussels. So how can we tell which way works best? Let's examine the historical record. Today, and for the last century, the worst environmental offenders have been big, repressive, socialist governments. This was true in the last century, and it's true now. China, for example, pumps roughly twice as much carbon into the air each year as the United States, even though the U.S. economy is almost 60% larger than China's. And how do those international agreements fare at protecting the environment? Not too well, it turns out. When President Trump announced his intention to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord, environmentalists warned of imminent disaster. Yet a year later, it turned out that the United States led the world in reducing carbon emissions. It did so without surrendering its national sovereignty. Moreover, Canada, the EU, and China, all signatories to the Paris Accord, not only failed to live up to their commitments, but increased their annual carbon emissions. The EU released an additional 40 million tons of carbon dioxide into the air that year. China, a whopping 120 million additional tons, all while wagging their fingers at Uncle Sam. Here's what you won't hear from your neighborhood Greenpeace volunteer. The left favors big government solutions not because it's better for the environment, but because it's better for leftism. Take a look at the Green New Deal, an environmental proposal embraced by virtually every major progressive in America. Forget for a moment the impracticality of a plan that would outlaw most forms of American energy and cost $93 trillion. Much of the proposal has nothing to do with the environment. Socialized medicine, reparations for historical wrongs, and a jobs guarantee program are just a few of the items on its wish list. What do socialized medicine and reparations for slavery have to do with the environment? Well, nothing. But for supporters of the Green New Deal, that's okay, because their primary goal is increasing government power well beyond anything we've ever seen in America. They need this power, presumably, to save us from ourselves. In contrast, conservatives are all about innovating our way to a cleaner environment without depriving anyone of their freedom. Take, for example, that monster of all green monsters, horizontal drilling for oil and gas, also known as fracking. The left demonizes fracking even though it actually makes the environment cleaner, the country richer, and now independent of Middle Eastern oil, something thought impossible a decade ago. How does it make the environment cleaner? By releasing up to 50% less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than coal. And since it's also cheaper, people are happy to buy it, not because government forces them to, but because it saves them money. By the way, according to a Harvard study, fracking is safe and improving all the time. Yep, innovation that produces abundant, clean energy at a fair price without infringing on my freedom. That works for this conservative. You'd think it would work for anyone who cares about the environment and people. So let me repeat, I love clean air and water. And I don't own even a single share of Exxon. I'm Michael Knowles, host of The Michael Knowles Show for Prager University.